Trigger warning. This video contains themes and images that some viewers may find distressing. Topics covered include violence, sexual assault, trauma, which may be triggering to certain individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is affected by these issues, please consider seeking support. It is no exaggeration to say that Saturday the 7th of October 2023 changed the status quo within the Middle East forever. And that armed incursion led by Hamas played the first step in dismantling the apartheid state known as Israel. Unless you have been living under a rock, the state of Israel has been doing everything within its power to wipe Gaza and the Palestinian people off the map once and for all. It will be years before we are given a final judgment on actions performed by Israel being classified as genocide. It should also be noted that the English-speaking population has been clobbered over the head with the strongest case of manufactured consent since George Bush and Tony Blair decided to invade Iraq. So how have journalists, political talking heads, sex toy vendors, and even presidents of the United States ensured that you think about nothing else apart from the question, do you condemn Hamas?
Here in the UK, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak visited a Jewish school in London to underline his support for the community. The visit followed several demonstrations across Britain, during which people voiced their backing for Hamas.
What the fuck? I guess I decided to start this video as I mean to go on. We all just witnessed the publicly funded and apparently impartial British broadcasting company classify widespread demonstrations where people showed solidarity, proudly wore the Palestinian flag, and even carried placards featuring some coconuts as simply supporters of Hamas. And this is incredibly significant because of what is said next.
Which many countries, including the UK and US, consider a terrorist organisation.
I mean, the math is incredibly simple but very powerful at the same time. You go out and request Israel stops dropping bombs on innocent people. Those innocent people are swapped out for Hamas. Hamas is classified as a terrorist organisation, and you are now magically a terrorist enabler. I mean, Jesus Christ, guys, if I knew when I left the house this morning that pleading bombs shouldn't be dropped on babies' heads, I would have been put on a terrorist watch list. I might not have bothered. I mean, the BBC actually wrote this on an auto cue.
Several demonstrations across Britain, during which people voiced their backing for Hamas.
But what are we supposed to expect from an impartial BBC where their Middle Eastern correspondents can't even say the term occupied West Bank?
And we understand that Israeli troops have now pulled out from one of the urban refugee camps that they were targeting in the north of the Jordan Valley, where they'd been backed up by military helicopters as well. They had said previously that they had found in a mosque there what they called an explosives lab and a command base for local Palestinian armed groups.
Fucking hell. At this point, the correspondent might as well just learn Aramaic and just speak in the historic language of the region, since you insist on using the historic geography of the region. But this is a clear pattern with the BBC. Their impartiality is clearly slanted in favour of establishment, reactionary and colonial thinking. When England and Northern Ireland were seeing racist fascist thugs terrorise the streets, attempt to burn asylum seekers alive within hotels, and destroyed a car belonging to a man providing care in the community, the BBC simply framed it as
the pro-British march on one side of the town hall here.
I guess that's one way to admit being pro-British is essentially being a right-wing fascist thug. Insert Tommy Robinson here. But let me try to refocus on the point. The BBC, which anyone could only conclude was an unofficial policy of painting anyone with any pro-Palestine inclinations as pro-terrorist also allowed other people the airtime to suggest the demonstrations calling for a ceasefire were a hotbed for anti-Semitic hate, along with a terrorist recruitment conference.
No, but that has not happened, and there's been lots of instances. There has not been outrage expressed by the organisers of those demonstrations about the radical Islamists who've been on those demonstrations. I'd like to have an open letter.
That was a very separate protest, that Hizb ut-Tahrir.
No, but there's a lot of people. I'm sure that you stood there and heard a lot of it. There has been a lot of people on the demonstrations shouting those slogans, and everyone has kind of calmly ignored it, looked the other way. And we've done that with radical Islam for some time now, which is why it's grown so much, I'm afraid.
Yes, because radical Islam is the problem here. While people are saying maybe it's a bad idea that people sign Israeli bombs, which will then be dropped on Gaza and turn Palestinian children into soup. But the real problem here, and the only thing stopping this woman from supporting a ceasefire, is a few lunatics on a largely peaceful protest. And maybe these people have it back to front, requesting ceasefires and humanitarian pauses. And I know human is in the word, but maybe you're not doing it for your other humans and just doing it for the benefit of yourself, just so, you know, you can go to bed that night.
That everybody needs to have their own pause and think, what am I doing? What difference is it making? Who am I influencing? Yeah. Or am I making myself feel better? I mean, look, we can't make ourselves feel better when kids are dying in the Gaza Strip, when people are captured by Hamas. 200 plus are actually in there, in the tunnels, frightened for their lives. People have just got to, frankly, let me just say this.
Yeah, go on.
People have got to grow up.
I absolutely love this clip. I don't believe we can ever reach true equality unless a blind man is allowed to be an absolute dickhead on television and also a genocidal maniac. I just want to commend the BBC for facilitating such a safe environment for David Blunkett to be his true self. But David is allowed to say this because the establishment generally accepts the Palestinians in Gaza will never be perfect victims because of Hamas. So swatting away calls for a humanitarian pause is fine because Hamas still has 200 hostages. And if you start to think that maybe some of those bombs may fall on the hostages, then you're thinking too hard. And if you think it's a bit weird that supporters of the Israeli state consider the phrase for liberation, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, as a genocidal call to wipe out all Jews, then you are maybe thinking too hard.
Did the president address Netanyahu's use of the phrase from the river to the sea in their conversation today? I know the White House has previously said that phrase is divisive, so...
I'm not aware that that specific phrase was discussed.
Them using that phrase.
Look, there's a connotation with that phrase. We've talked about this before, but when you use the phrase "river to the sea," it speaks basically to the mantra of Hamas and in their manifesto, where they basically describe the geographic bounds of what they believe to be Palestine. And if you look at it on the map, if you go look at the four corners that they describe it, it's basically the state of Israel. They just don't believe it should exist. So again, it's not a phrase that that we recommend using, given because of that context.
Hamas, this was Netanyahu.
I understand. I don't have anything more on that, and I certainly don't have anything more on the conversation to read out with respect to that.
Well, that's embarrassing. I've watched that word soup at least 13 or 14 times, and this is what I have deciphered what is being said about the phrase from the river to the sea. If you are brown, we can't get down. If you are white, you might be right. Anyway, going back to Hamas, when I said they were a terrorist organization earlier, I was just repeating the words of the BBC, who were in turn repeating the policy of the United Kingdom government and the United States government. I don't consider Hamas a terrorist organization in the same way I don't believe Nelson Mandela and ANC were terrorists, as labeled by Margaret Thatcher's government.
Do I agree with Hamas? It doesn't matter.
Because Hamas is the result of 2 million people being held in an open-air prison with zero quality of life and no opportunities for the future. And to leave out this important context reveals you to be either incredibly ignorant or deliberately genocidal.
The actions, the terrorist atrocity that Hamas perpetrated will cause more difficulty for the Palestinian people.
Difficulty? James is acting like the Palestinian people are trying to open a bank account and can't find a proof of address. These people are trying to liberate themselves from an open-air prison and not get bombed in the process. Now, you may have question marks over how they liberate themselves, but when they try to do it in a peaceful manner, they were chopped down like trees in a forest.
And I would call on all responsible states, particularly Middle East responsible states, to call this out for what it is and to stand with the world in condemning, utterly condemning, these actions by Hamas.
A pathetic propagandized talking point being pushed here by leader of the opposition at the time, Sir Keir Rodney Starmer. Getting responsible Middle Eastern states to condemn Hamas would just run cover for Israel to continue its bombing campaign in Gaza, because you can say, look, the Arab states condemn Hamas and realize this is the only course of action.
I want to use my voice to say that there are 2.2 million innocent people in Gaza. The vast overwhelming majority will be innocent, nothing to do with Hamas, who are suffering a human catastrophe. And the international community has to step up. A very simple principle: the life of a Palestinian is equal to the life of an Israeli.
What's most frustrating is when people who profess to be pro-Palestinian start adopting the talking points of the other side. This necessity to put clear daylight between Hamas and the rest of the Gaza population, because these pro-Palestinian voices accept that Hamas is akin to ISIS. And we get it, 50% of Gaza is under 18, meaning they could never have voted for Hamas when they were elected at the last election in 2007. But that shouldn't matter. Even if there is a 13 or 14-year-old in Gaza that looks up to a member of Hamas as a hero or a freedom fighter, that doesn't mean they deserve a bomb being dropped on their heads. In the same way, I don't believe a 13 or 14-year-old who supports or looks up to Tommy Robinson or Nigel Farage should have their fucking head kicked in. It's not rocket science. But what do I know? Maybe it is rocket science, because most people fail to understand why it was vital for Israel to ensure the English-speaking world were signed up to the notion of condemning Hamas.
Humanity remains haunted by the massacre unleashed by Hamas on October 7th. A massacre of innocent lives. Israeli men, women, children, and babies were beheaded, executed, raped, and burnt alive.
Now, I don't believe anyone is denying Hamas and other groups that entered Israel on October 7th, 2023 ended up killing a lot of people. Atrocities which are bad in their own rights. However, for some reason, this Israeli G.I. Joe decided to add some extra charges to the mix. Beheadings, executions, sexual assaults in the form of rapes, and people being burnt alive. So let's take each accusation one at a time. But I'm going to remove the execution part, because beheading is a form of execution and not a style of massage therapy. Let's first examine accusations of rape on an industrial scale.
This has enormous implications for the other wave of atrocity stories that began very quickly, which is to do with sexual violence, and particularly the Israeli assertion that it was widespread and systematic.
And in case you had missed it, it was sort of everywhere.
Young girls who were raped and then murdered.
Women brutally raped and murdered.
With this premise being repeated at every opportunity, included by people that were very close friends of Jeffrey Epstein.
Where are all those radical feminists when it comes to the Hamas rapes of young Jewish girls, sexual abuse, beheadings? They are quiet. They are silent. The incredible hypocrisy of the Me Too movement. Me Too, except if you're a Jew. And I want to have a list of all the radical feminists who are pushing hard, and I understand that, to get all these names revealed. And I want to know how many of them have ever actually condemned Hamas for the rapes that we now know occurred and the murders that occurred. How many have been silent, and how many, like the National Lawyers Guild, have actually approved of what Hamas did? So let's put this in context.
And in case it had gone over your head, this fossil was invited on Fox News in order to discuss his very good friend Jeffrey Epstein, but he decided to spiral and go on a rant about the people in Gaza and radical feminists. Tell me you huff glue without telling me you huff glue. And this hyperfixation on rapes doesn't stop with October 7th. Apparently Hamas is choosing to continue this practice with the hostages as well.
But most importantly, we want the 134 innocent Israeli hostages, and many of them are being raped.
What is it with you and rape?
Hey Michael, are you receiving? Can we invite this particular guest back? I really need to get his opinion on the accusation Israeli soldiers are sexually assaulting Palestinian prisoners. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't getting sexually assaulted while being hostages, but this individual doesn't know for sure, and he's allowed to make these claims on a worldwide broadcast with no pushback whatsoever. And it's such a strange fixation for supporters of Israel to have, but it sort of makes sense when you consider Israel is now a safe haven for sexual offenders.
To be clear, in the film, we are not saying that there were no rapes on October the 7th. We simply don't know. What we are saying is that there simply is not the evidence. There's not the forensic evidence, there's not the visual evidence, there's not the photographic evidence, and there is not the witness evidence to support the allegation of widespread and systematic rape. A lot of the world's leading media outlets have done in-depth investigations where they have concluded there was widespread, systematic, instrumentalized, weaponized rape. And there is no real evidence for widespread and systematic rape.
And I think that is an important distinction to make clear. Nobody is saying no sexual assault happened, but only questioning the systematic nature, and it was a foundation for the surprise attack. But I would suggest you watch the Al Jazeera documentary on October 7th yourself. It is incredibly insightful. The next claim leveled towards Hamas was the very visceral image of babies and beheadings.
The peculiarity of the days after October 7 is that the Israeli media and subsequently the international media choose to focus not on the very real and extensive crimes that Hamas and others did commit, but on crimes they did not commit. And this had two focuses. In the days immediately after, it's to do with babies. The most dramatic one is we see an allegation that there were 40 babies killed, many of them beheaded.
Little kids who are beheaded.
Pictures of terrorists beheading children.
Child beheaders, yes, evil Hamas, James.
At organisations like the BBC, we now know that there was a pregnant woman who had her belly cut open, the baby was removed from her stomach and beheaded in front of her. There's videos of this, and yet the
Which
BBC...
is unverified. We haven't seen these videos.
You haven't seen it. I know many people who have seen it. These videos are in existence. There's countless others and countless other examples that the journalists sat through the other day to prove this is existing because of such denial.
This is very simple to deal with because we have a comprehensive list of the dead. We know that 2 babies are killed on October the 7th. One is an 10-month-old child who is hit by a bullet fired through a safe room door. The other is a child who dies after an emergency cesarean, a Bedouin child, in fact. Now, any story about babies that does not relate to those 2, and there are a lot of stories about babies, is not true. We know it's not true.
So the final claim about what happened on the October 7th attacks involved babies, ovens, and people being burnt alive.
These bastards put these babies in an oven and put on their oven. We found the kid a few hours later.
2 piles of 10 children each were tied to the back, burned to death.
They took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
The baby that was connected to the cord was stabbed, and she was shot in the back.
In retrospect, all of these videos feature the most unhinged behavior I've ever encountered. The Israeli government themselves released a list of the ages and names of the dead. So are we to believe that this man was just tripping on mushrooms when he explained what he saw in those houses? Like, you can't make the up. But unfortunately for us, these guys did make this up.
So no babies were beheaded, no babies were thrown into ovens. Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether this type of atrocity was committed but not that type? People were killed in this way, not that way. It matters because the murder of babies and widespread rape has a particular resonance. It's particularly triggering. The Israeli government and its supporters, when they justify the brutality of the subsequent bombardment and invasion of the Gaza Strip, again and again and again, what they always reference is babies and rape.
You know, I'm very puzzled by the constant concern which the world and also Britain, I must say, Mark, is showing for the Palestinian people, and is actually showing for these horrible, inhuman animals who have done the worst atrocities that this century has seen, and the worst atrocities that Jews have suffered since the Holocaust.
If you want to dehumanize an enemy, if you want to desensitize people to the suffering that is inflicted on that enemy, then you portray them as barbarians, basically as savages, as people who are not deserving of humane treatment.
And if we're being honest with ourselves, the dehumanization of the Palestinian people has been happening for 75 years, and is the only explanation why everyone within a position of power has been so comfortable with the Palestinian people either being subjected to an open-air prison in Gaza or an occupation in the West Bank.
Every single settler colonial society has to dehumanize the people that they displace and the people they massacre to live with themselves.
And I think the marginalization and dehumanization of the Palestinian people is a very important topic to analyze further, and I will try to do that in upcoming videos titled "This Started October 7th" and "There is no genocide." But staying with "Do you condemn Hamas?", what is a propaganda machine to do when all of your accusations focused on the attack itself are more or less debunked by reputable investigative journalists? Firstly, you could just forget about it and move on as if nothing happened, or you can go on live television to say,
and I think this is the moment where we're fighting pure evil, and the Americans know. This is why they're projecting so much support, and the British know.
Now, I personally believe there are so many evil people in world history, so I can only guess who will be the avatar used to justify using bombs to rip children apart.
So this is Adolf Hitler's book, translated to Arabic, Mein Kampf. It's the book that led to the Holocaust and the book that led to World War II. This is the book that led to his victory in elections in Germany, which led to the worst atrocity of humankind, which the British fought against. Well, this book was found just a few days ago in northern Gaza in a children's living room, which was turned into a military operation base of Hamas, on the body of one of the terrorists and murderers of Hamas. And he even he wrote notes, he marked and learned again and again Adolf Hitler's ideology of hating the Jews, of killing the Jews, of burning the Jews, of slaughtering the Jews. This is the real warrior act.
Oh my god, I've been so stupid. It was Adolf Hitler all along. Mein Kampf in a child's bedroom. Why didn't you just say this before? You now have my blessing. Go ahead, throw bombs on all the children you want. Now, the biggest issue with believing there is the cleanest copy of Mein Kampf translated into Arabic sitting next to a dead Hamas fighter is that you will then have top politicians in Germany repeating this notion that there is some type of ideological link between Hamas and Nazis, thus justifying everything Israel did after October 7th.
So you see what happens here. Here's a German condoning the killing of hundreds of thousands of German children, and by that justifying the tens of thousands of Palestinian children who are being killed by making the association Nazis, Gaza.
The German children in question that were mentioned in this clip were the poor innocent ones indiscriminately targeted during World War II in the cities of Dresden and Hamburg. I've been to Hamburg and seen the war crimes committed by British and American fighter planes, and quite frankly, it's disgusting. And any claim that these attacks won the war are flat out lies, because we all know it was because of the Soviets. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, in addition to bursting through the gates on October 7th, 2023 and killing unarmed civilians, particularly those young people at a music festival, it has been claimed that Hamas systematically raped people, beheaded children and threw their bodies in ovens. Also, Hamas is continuing to rape their hostages, and this is all being fueled by a deep-rooted hatred of Jews because they idolize Adolf Hitler. I mean, it makes sense to me. I think even I'm getting persuaded now. What else have these monsters been up to?
Hamas puts your life in danger by placing weapons and forces within civilians' area in Gaza, including schools, mosques, and hospitals.
And who could forget the Disney Pixar depiction of what the Hamas super military base under the hospital looked like? I mean, look at that office with that massive flag and those lovely chairs and tables. Who could have imagined this might have been a slight exaggeration? Well, not the British Broadcasting Company.
Israel described the Al-Shifa hospital as the main headquarters for Hamas's terrorist activity. This IDF animation, posted in late October, claims to represent a Hamas tunnel system underneath the hospital. But having been inside Al-Shifa since early Wednesday, Israel's yet to produce evidence of the tunnels. It has allowed the BBC and Fox News to film at the hospital, though only locations of Israel's choice.
This is what they found.
Israel also released its own 7-minute video, which BBC Verify has analysed. A watch, visible in that video, suggests it was filmed a few hours before the BBC arrived. And this IDF video was posted, then deleted, then reposted, this time without a section referring to an Israeli soldier who'd been held hostage.
I don't know when this was used the last time.
Also in the video, we see a room with an MRI machine.
And if you zoom in and we get some light over here, what you'll be able to see is military equipment.
The BBC was shown the same room, and what we see in the two videos doesn't precisely match. For example, there's one gun in the IDF video, two by the time of the BBC footage. Israel has told BBC Verify this is because more weaponry and terrorist assets were discovered throughout the day.
And as always, an AK-47.
Israel also says its video is a single shot with no edits, but this appears to be an edit. We don't know the reasons for that edit, nor how significant it is. The IDF, though, says suggestions it's manipulating the media are incorrect. The IDF video also shows military equipment in other locations, though we can't verify how it came to be there. And what we see in this IDF video doesn't equate to Israel's description of Al-Shifa as an operational command center for Hamas. The US is using a different phrase, saying Al-Shifa was used as a command and control node. That implies a much smaller facility. Israel is adamant this hospital was a command center, but for now at least, it's either not found supporting evidence or it's not sharing it.
It must have absolutely broke the BBC's heart that they had to put out this report. But you can still tell that the BBC is ready to eat anything the Israeli government feeds them, like a nice warm bowl of porridge. But I'm comfortable in saying that Al-Shifa hospital wasn't used as a Hamas command center. But this notion of human shields is still spread in other ways.
But it's really, really important point. We are seeing Hamas telling Palestinians not to leave northern Gaza, despite the fact that Israel, both through social media communications, through leaflet drops and through the news channels.
But even if they tell them...
This is really important. No, Victoria, this is really important. So Israel are saying you should leave northern Gaza for your own safety. Hamas is trying to prevent Palestinians from doing so because Hamas wants those civilians to be a human shield against Israel's actions.
Calling James cleverly a f***ing idiot is an insult to f***ing idiots everywhere. How did he know that Hamas was stopping people from leaving northern Gaza? How was the IDF sharing these messages to leave through social media when they cut off the internet? And even if you did send out paper leaflets requesting people to leave, it then doesn't transfer the responsibilities of their deaths to themselves.
And we need to remember, Hamas was targeting our children, but we're not targeting any civilians. We're targeting only military targets.
Okay, I don't want to be nitpicky, Mrs. Ambassador, but it would seem those military targets are jam-packed with civilians and innocent children. Now let's imagine for a moment you have ignored the suggestion of Hamas using Palestinian civilians as human shields. I guess the one thing we can all agree on is that Hamas still does have Israeli hostages.
And as we speak, there are still 199 Israelis, including children and Holocaust survivors, grandparents, that are kept hostage in Hamas hands, that we all need to call together, bring them back home.
Release the Israeli hostages! Release the Israeli hostages! Release the Israeli hostages!
We're Zionists. Of course we support the IDF's mission to dismantle Hamas and release the hostages.
Crazy and weird Zionists put to one side, I can openly admit I hate the idea of Hamas taking innocent civilians as hostages, just like I hate the idea of the Israeli government holding thousands of Palestinians as prisoners without charge.
And now we'll show you more evidence. In this room, there is a list. This list, in Arabic, this list says we are in an operation. The operation against Israel started in the 7th of October. This is a Guardian list where every terrorist writes his name and every terrorist has his own shift guarding the people that were here.
This was probably one of the more funny acts of buffoonery. Clearly this jarhead had no idea what the writing in Arabic meant, but decided to write his own attempts at fan fiction right before our very eyes. It has since been revealed that what he was referring to were just simply days of the week. And it got me thinking, imagine that book they found with Hitler on the cover was simply 1,000 poems about how bad Hitler was, and the Israelis couldn't tell because it was written in Arabic. Of course I'm being facetious. I have no reason to believe it isn't a copy of Mein Kampf in Arabic. I just don't understand why a Hamas fighter would have a hard copy when he has access to the internet. Anyway, just to close out this chapter on the hostages being held by Hamas, we've already seen some prisoner swaps, and it would seem that some of these hostages weren't treated that badly. I mean, compared to what we've been told Hamas is capable of. This video of Hamas releasing these two elderly women can be defined as propaganda without a shadow of a doubt. But at the same time, why would Hamas treat their hostages really poorly if the plan was always to send them back, on the provision that concessions need to be made on the Israeli side? And it was really interesting to see that even once the Israelis got back to Israel, they didn't really have that much to say apart from the trauma of being kidnapped in the first place, of course. Call me naive, but it doesn't sound like the actions of inhumane, bloodthirsty terrorists. Every accusation of Hamas crumbles under the softest of scrutiny, and it should be considered morally depraved to associate them with ISIS and the Nazi Party, because the origins and the objectives are clearly not the same. But as soon as you try to show even the slightest compassion for the Palestinian people, you are immediately hit with,
as you know, Hamas is still firing rockets in our cities.
You have to admire the dedication to the talking points. This was a response to the breaking news that 300 people had been killed after a hospital in Gaza was hit.
There is no way this could have been the IDF
Hamas is still firing rockets into Israel.
A few days after this airstrike, it was almost impossible to decipher which information was true and which information was false. Nobody wanted to claim responsibility. Hamas was blaming Israel, saying you're already bombing the hell out of Gaza anyway, and Israel was blaming Hamas, claiming it was a misdirected Hamas rocket. Israel even released a dodgy voice recording of two supposed Hamas fighters sweating bullets over the accident. Funny enough, Israel got most of the establishment media to believe their side of the story. The IDF is probably the only army in the world that can use "trust me bro" as a reliable source of information. If you are to believe that Hamas fired a rocket at their own hospital, this reinforces the sentiment that Hamas doesn't care about its own citizens, which is intrinsically linked to this concept of human shields. If you happen to be that human shield, you're usually doing it against your will.
But it's really, really important point. We are seeing Hamas telling Palestinians not to leave northern Gaza.
So you can appreciate my further confusion when we are asked to speculate over how much support Hamas actually has in the Gaza Strip.
The Palestinian people in Gaza, do you know how much Hamas is supported by them?
Let's not focus on a Snapchat here. Just
No,
last
I'm
Saturday.
not focusing on a Snapchat.
No, you are.
I'm asking you a question. If you know, and if you can explain to our audience here in the UK, how much Hamas is supported by Palestinians in Gaza?
Why didn't you bring me here when the Israeli finance minister in Paris only recently?
Please, would you answer my question?
No, this is the right question. This is the right question because there is so much asymmetry in the conversation.
And
really.
I would like to ask you if you know how much support Hamas has in Gaza from Palestinian people.
Well, from previous polls, from previous incidents, the majority of the people in Gaza do not belong to political factions, and those who do, the majority of them are Fatah. That's a fact.
Okay, that's a fact. That's good to hear. Thank you.
One of the things we realized that every school, every mosque, every second house has an access to tunnel. So this is, and of course ammunition.
But that's an argument for destroying the whole of Gaza, every single building in it.
So do you have another solution how to destroy the underground tunnel city, that this is the place where the terrorists hide, where they have all their ammunition?
It's really, really hard to decide. Everyone in the Gaza Strip simultaneously supports Hamas and also are being used as human shields. This everyone supports Hamas / human shields argument will definitely be revisited in a later video, but I don't want to finish this video on points that will be addressed in later videos. Residing in the global north means I am exposed to propaganda which is relentless. It almost feels like that every journalist within Gaza has one perspective and the vast majority of journalists sitting outside of Gaza have another. But this is only true for Western countries. There are those brave people living on the border of the conflict that have never drunk the Israeli / US State Department Kool-Aid.
We ask you to condemn it. Where are your condemnations? Where's your channel covering this? Cover this. Say the truth. We understand you're an employee. You're just a puppet. You're just a mouthpiece. Come talk to me like a human being. Come talk to me like a human being. Thank you. I understand you have your foreign policy. No, I've heard you. I've heard you. You hear me. I understand you have your foreign policy. I understand you speak for your government. I understand you represent your government. But that being said, you're a country that's claimed free speech. Your customized democracy is actually what led to Hamas. And now we are watching an occupation, and we are watching the result of your silence, of your misrepresentation of Arabs.
And now, a year later, more and more establishment mouthpieces are waking up to the reality of people in Gaza.
An absolute abomination, but compounded by public support for the culprits. And if you cast your mind back to October of last year, when it was almost a capital offence to point out that the Palestinian people in Gaza had legitimate grievances about their historical treatment, without even flirting with the notion of defending or condoning in any way the barbarism of the terrorists on that day. Nobody who takes money on a monthly basis to comment upon current affairs has, to the best of my knowledge, publicly revoked their support for Israel, publicly acknowledged that things have now gone to a point that they cannot credit and cannot even begin to condone. They have all gone silent. And I don't understand why, because look, let me show you how easy it is. This is barbarism. This is behavior so disgusting, so despicable, that just when you think you might have got your head around it, along come protesters demanding the release of the culprits.
Do you know how cooked you are when you've lost Mr. Liberal himself, James O'Brien? I mean, it only took Israeli guards sexually assaulting Palestinian prisoners, but a win's a win in my view. And that's why I'm actually filled with hope that I might actually see the collapse of the Israeli apartheid state within my lifetime. We've seen this story before. The world, regardless of what I think of it, is progressing and will always progress. So colonizers, reactionaries, and right-wing dictators can only colonize, react, and dip in for so long. We saw it in South Africa, and we all know how that story ended. And before that, we saw it in Kenya. And I'm reminded of these powerful words spoken by the powerful thinker Malcolm X.
Well, this was a terrorist organization that didn't just defend themselves from specific acts, but initiated acts of terrorism. Do you favor that in this country?
No, I think that the conditions that prevailed in Kenya forced the Mau Mau to take action. And any action that they took, even though it seemed that they were initiating it, actually it was a defensive action. And it was a reaction to the colonial powers that were exploiting them.
But do you favor such an organization here?
Does white America favor the Ku Klux Klan or the Citizens Council? And as long as the government, police bodies, do nothing about the existence of white terror groups that are terrorizing blacks, then it's time for blacks to do whatever is necessary to put these white terror groups in their place. And I feel that a Mau Mau could wipe out the Klan in the north, south, east, and west, and wherever it exists. I'm not against the idea at all.
So I believe there is a lot of hope. All supporters of a liberated Palestine will be able to smile one day knowing the work is now done. I also hold the strong belief that an oppressed people are only as strong as their children, and seeing these children laughing and smiling despite having nothing and playing in literal rubble indicates to me that these children don't want revenge. They just want to be children and given the opportunity to live past the age of 18 years old.
Why do you refuse to condemn Hamas when in fact, it's actually so easy to do that, and there are repercussions for not playing that game?
I'm not passing judgment on Hamas because Hamas, for better or for worse, ended up being the only resistance organization that expressed this duty, not right, but duty of the people of Gaza, of the people of Palestine generally, to bring down the wall.
But in a situation in which for decades the Israeli state has occupied and oppressed and besieged and bombarded Palestinians, for people in the West who have not been in that position to spend their time condemning the things that Palestinians do when our governments fund the Israeli war machine, I just think it's the wrong choice of our attention. I think that's wrong. And I think that to compare Palestinians, and you said you wouldn't do this, but to compare Palestinians to anti-Semitic persecutors of Jews who rounded us up just for living in Europe and put us eventually in gas chambers, to tar Europe's shame at its failure to prevent centuries of anti-Semitism, and to accuse Palestinians who did not carry out the Holocaust, Europeans did, to accuse Palestinians of that because they just want to live in peace and freedom, I think it's just frankly sickening. It genuinely sickens me. It's an insult to generations of my family members who were butchered by the same kind of brutality and exclusion that said some people are human animals, that now we see carried out by the State of Israel. Yes, those people in the State of Israel are Jews, but they've taken on the European Gentiles' way of thinking about the world. They've taken on all the violence that they call Western civilization, which says some people have rights and other people don't. And so just as we had to break the back of Tsarism, and just as we had to break the back of every anti-Semitic regime, and just as we had to break the back of European colonialism everywhere, we have to break the back of the Zionist state so that everyone can be free. Everyone can live in peace and freedom.
Oh, Somehow I forgot to include a prominent figure within the body of this video, somebody I alluded to in the beginning, possibly the strongest advocate of the question, do you condemn Hamas? The one and only and self-described
baboon in a suit.
But yet you continue to trash her.
Okay, I'm done with this.
No.
Sorry, no.
Sorry. Do you know what? That's
You can trash me, but not mine.
No. I've been...
Sorry, can't
This
do
is
this.
absolutely diabolical behaviour.
being called out for his awful behaviour inspired Piers Morgan to leave his morning show like a baby back bitch. But Israel's assault on Gaza has enabled him to reinvent himself as a hard man yet impartial observer on his show titled
Piers Morgan Uncensored.
One, if you could just slightly manage your language. We are uncensored, but if you keep swearing,
I'm very sorry.
We have to apologise to viewers who may be offended by that.
Okay.
Piers Morgan 90% uncensored.
So join me in the next edition of Do You Condemn Hamas as I take a deep dive into the Israeli propaganda machine, which is journalist and professional loudmouth Piers Stefan Pugh Morgan.